In the quiet hum of pre-industrial life, before the rise of electric washing machines and the broad commercial availability of soap, the act of laundering garments was a practice bound by the rhythm of nature, the tools of the hand, and the quiet rituals passed down through generations. Though it was not considered noble work, nor often documented with much fanfare, the cleaning of clothes formed an essential part of daily maintenance, practiced in 100 subtle variations across regions, climates, and centuries. It was work often carried out slowly, over several days, and mostly by women, mothers, daughters, widows, and servants, who had learned the craft not from books, but through long observation and repetition. One must begin with the setting. Imagine a modest European village in the late 1300s. The sun rises slowly over fields of rye and barley, and the air is still thick with the dew of the previous night. Small cottages line a dirt track, their timber frames set atop low stone foundations. These dwellings are modest, built by hand, with thatched roofs darkened by time and smoke from hearth fires within. Between these homes, narrow footpaths lead toward the nearby brook, a meandering thread of water, clear and cold, flanked by low shrubs and pale stones smoothed by centuries of flow. It is near this brook that laundering typically begins, though in colder months or in wealthier households, garments might be washed indoors using water heated slowly over the hearth. The peasantry, however, relied on the flowing water, which carried away dirt and odors, and which did not require drawing by bucket from the village well. The garments themselves were few and precious. Most people owned no more than 2 or 3 sets of clothing, and often fewer. These were sewn by hand, using durable fabrics such as wool or linen. Linen, derived from flax, was used for undergarments and shifts because of its lighter weight and smooth texture, while wool, thick and insulating, was more common in outerwear. Each item was cared for with attention and repaired often. Patches were sewn with quiet practicality, not hidden, but accepted as part of the life cycle of fabric. Before washing began, garments were first inspected for tears or loose stitching. Mending was usually done before laundering as wet fabric was heavier and more difficult to sew. The process of cleaning began with soaking. In a large wooden tub or a hollowed-out trough lined with rough stones, garments were submerged in cold or lukewarm water. If wood ashes were available, and they often were, collected from the household hearth, they were mixed with water to create a kind of primitive lye solution, alkaline and mildly caustic. This solution did not create lather in the modern sense, but it helped to break down oils and odors embedded in the fabric. Lye water was poured over the clothes slowly, sometimes filtered through a layer of straw or cloth to catch coarse debris. The tub would be left undisturbed for hours, or sometimes overnight, allowing the mixture to penetrate the fabric fibers. This soaking process was crucial, especially for heavily soiled items, such as those worn during fieldwork or tending to animals. During this time, women might sit nearby, darning socks or spinning thread, while keeping an eye on children or stirring pots of gruel warming on a nearby fire. The next stage involved agitation and rinsing. There were no motors or drums. Instead, garments were beaten gently with wooden paddles, often called beetles or battling sticks. These were flat boards with handles, carved from hardwood, and sometimes worn smooth by generations of use. Beating the clothes loosened dirt and grime, and in some places garments were slapped against smooth stones set near the river's edge for this purpose. The sound of fabric striking stone was rhythmic, slow, and meditative, echoing across the quiet water and into the open fields beyond. In areas where rivers were too distant or unsafe due to flooding or wildlife, large barrels or wash tubs were used instead. Water was carried from wells or collected rainwater cisterns and heated slowly in iron cauldrons suspended over the hearth. This water, poured over clothing and stirred with long wooden poles, mimicked the soaking process that running water provided in the warmer months. Rinsing was an equally essential step. Ash lye, while effective, was not entirely benign to fabric if left to sit too long. It was important to remove all residue through repeated rinsing, typically using clean, flowing water. Women would wring out each garment by hand, twist by twist, then submerge it again, and repeat. Fingers grew red and raw in the colder seasons, especially when ice clung to the edges of the brook and steam rose from breath and cloth alike. The pace of the work was unhurried, dictated more by necessity than by urgency. Once clean, garments were laid out to dry. In warm months, clothes were spread on hedgerows, bushes, or wooden racks built for the purpose. In colder seasons, they were hung near hearths, though this took longer and risked the scent of smoke lingering in the cloth. Some families had dedicated drying lofts, small attic spaces ventilated by slats, where clothes could hang from ropes suspended from the beams. The act of drying itself was not entirely passive. Garments had to be turned, shaken, and checked. Woolen items in particular had to be reshaped by hand to prevent shrinkage or distortion. This process, called blocking, involved gently pulling the fabric back into form while it dried. Larger households or communal living situations might designate a shared drying green, a flat patch of grass near the edge of the village, sometimes roped off, where everyone could lay out linens in the sun. The rhythm of laundry was woven into the greater fabric of life. In many communities, there were customary days for washing. Monday was a common wash day across many parts of Europe, though regional and seasonal variations existed. This allowed for a kind of quiet synchronicity, as multiple households worked alongside one another, chatting softly, exchanging news, or simply performing their tasks in companionable silence. The predictability of it brought a certain comfort. There were no deadlines or machines, only the steady march of days, the rising and setting of the sun, and the ever-present need for clean clothing. Among wealthier households, laundry was often delegated to servants or professional washwomen. In cities and larger towns, these laundresses formed guilds or informal associations. They would gather at designated washing places, often located downstream from where drinking water was drawn, and bring with them large bundles of linen from various clients. These women knew the habits of each household, the preferred scent of drying herbs, the precise stiffness of collars, or the favored folding method for undergarments. Their work was quiet, skilled, and often underappreciated. Herbs were sometimes used in the rinse water, not for cleansing power, but for scent and mild disinfectant qualities. Lavender, rosemary, or thyme might be steeped in hot water, which was then poured over the garments in a final rinse. This left a faint, pleasant aroma that lingered after drying, especially in sheets and sleeping garments. In some areas, dried flowers were sewn into sachets and placed in linen chests to preserve freshness between wears. The storage of clean clothing followed its own traditions. In modest cottages, garments were folded and placed in woven baskets or laid flat on shelves carved into the stone wall. Wealthier homes had wooden chests with iron fittings, some of them passed down through generations. Linen was stored separately from wool to prevent infestation by moths, and dried bay leaves or cedar shavings might be placed inside as a deterrent. The tools of laundering were simple, and their design changed little over centuries. Beating paddles, rinsing vats, clotheslines, ringers of twisted wood or stone weights, each had a specific purpose, born of long experience rather than sudden invention. These implements were not named in documents nor displayed with pride, but they were used every day, their worn edges polished by touch and time. Even the concept of cleanliness was different. Modern standards of daily laundering and bright white fabrics did not exist. Dirt was accepted as a byproduct of labor. Stains were treated with caution, sometimes covered with embroidery or hidden with layers. The goal of laundry was not perfection, but preservation, to keep garments wearable, comfortable, and suitable for one more week of work, or worship, or rest. Across regions, whether in the misty hills of Wales, the stony valleys of Provence, the flat lowlands of Flanders, or the forest villages of Bavaria, the practice remained much the same. Soak, agitate, rinse, wring, dry, fold, and mend. And though it demanded time and effort, it was not considered burdensome in the same way as other labor. It was work done with hands and water, guided by rhythm and season. In coastal regions, where fresh water was less abundant or brackish due to tidal influence, the washing of garments required alternative methods and even greater resourcefulness. In such places, rainwater was collected with care and stored in large clay or wooden cisterns, shaded to prevent spoilage and algae growth. These cisterns were covered with wooden lids or thatch to discourage debris or animals. Laundry days were sometimes postponed until sufficient water was available, particularly during drier seasons when every drop had value. In maritime towns, seaweed was occasionally used as a mild abrasive or softening agent, though not universally. Some communities believed it imparted an unwanted odor to fabrics, while others appreciated the gentle texture it gave to woolen garments. Washed seaweed, dried in the sun, and crumbled into rinsing tubs, became part of the local practice in some island communities, passed on without documentation, remembered only in the hands of the elderly and the habits of the young who imitated them. On the subject of tools, one finds curious regional variations. In parts of Scandinavia, for example, broad wooden washboards were developed earlier than elsewhere. These consisted of smooth planks carved with shallow ridges, over which garments could be rubbed back and forth with the hands. The pressure, combined with the gentle friction, removed dirt without tearing fibers. These boards were often made of birch, a pale, straight-grained wood that resisted warping, even when wet. In Central Europe, particularly in alpine villages, one might find stone-built washing huts along mountain streams. These huts, sometimes called washhäuser, were communal, with wide openings for light and ventilation, and sloped floors that allowed water to drain away. Inside, benches and stone basins were arranged for the convenience of multiple users. The steady noise of the stream outside blended with the occasional murmur of women inside, their voices low, their movements unhurried. Temperature played a subtle but significant role in laundry. During winter, the work slowed. Water froze in buckets if left too long. Hands grew numb more quickly. In some places, the process was adapted. Garments were frozen clean, laid out in snowbanks and left overnight. The ice crystals were believed to lift dirt from fabric as they formed and melted. It was not a thoroughly effective method, but in times of hardship, it sufficed to refresh linens and outerwear until a proper washing could be arranged. The concept of soap, as understood in the modern sense, a scented, solid bar that lathers easily, was not widespread before the industrial period. Instead, the cleansing agent used was either lye, as previously mentioned, or a concoction of fuller's earth, a naturally occurring clay with mild absorbent properties. In England and parts of the Low Countries, fuller's earth was mixed with water to form a paste and smeared on woolens. After resting, the garments were rinsed thoroughly. This method helped to remove grease and restore the cloth's natural feel without harsh abrasion. For special items, church linens, altar cloths, or festive garments, extra care was taken. These items might be boiled in large copper kettles, suspended over open fires, with elderflower or horse chestnut added to the water. Some believed that these additions whitened fabric or softened water. Whether the effect was real or imagined, the ritual persisted. After boiling, the linens were rinsed, wrung by hand or with wooden presses, and then laid flat to dry on clean grass or bleached boards. Drying methods, too, were subject to regional custom. In Italy, washing lines were strung between windows across narrow alleyways, high above the street. The sight of garments fluttering gently in the breeze, casting slow shadows on cobbled stone below, was a familiar and unremarkable part of daily life. In the Netherlands, long wooden racks, known as droogreken, were used in back gardens or communal yards. In colder regions, as previously noted, indoor drying was the norm, often using ceiling-mounted pulley systems that allowed linens to be hoisted toward the rafters, where heat collected. Folding was a concluding task, and not without method. Large items like bed linens were folded multiple times into squares, then pressed beneath heavy books or stones to ensure neatness. Smaller items, kerchiefs, napkins, undergarments, were stacked or rolled, depending on space. In some households, a specific shelf or drawer was designated for each family member's clothing. Children learned early which stack was theirs, and older children might be assigned the task of retrieving and returning garments. The garments themselves bore the mark of their use. Linen undergarments might discolor with time despite diligent washing. Woolen cloaks, rarely washed fully due to the danger of shrinking, were brushed, aired, and spot cleaned. Fur-lined items were turned inside out and beaten gently with rods to release dust and insects. The maintenance of these items was a constant act of prevention rather than restoration, to preserve rather than replace. In communal dwellings or among households with many servants, laundry became a more organized affair. There were designated laundry rooms, often built with stone or tile to resist moisture. Large tubs were set into the floor, and sloped gutters carried wastewater outside. Fires were kept burning constantly to heat water, and the air hung with the scent of damp wool, smoke, and ashes. Laundry maids wore aprons of rough linen and wrapped their hair tightly to avoid stray strands falling into water or onto clean cloth. In city records from the 15th and 16th centuries, one finds references to the employment of full-time washerwomen. These women would travel from house to house, carrying with them a bundle of tools, a paddle, a bar of coarse soap if available, perhaps a length of rope for drying, and a wooden rod for stirring. They charged by the item or by the hour, and their presence in the household was as ordinary as that of the chimney sweep or the knife sharpener. Their work was not praised, but it was necessary, and they knew the habits of many homes by heart. The passage of time in laundering was slow. It was not compressed into a cycle, nor regulated by buttons or dials. It began with the gathering of garments and the inspection of weather. If rain threatened, plans were changed. If the wind was dry and constant, drying would be swift. Decisions were made not in haste, but in quiet consensus with nature. Laundry days began at dawn and ended near dusk, the hands of the washer swollen and red, the air still thick with the scent of water and earth. Beyond Europe, similar processes existed. In early Japan, riverbank laundering was a communal act, conducted in silence or in soft speech, with garments scrubbed against flat stones and rinsed in flowing water. Soap, made from the ashes of burnt rice straw and mixed with water, was used sparingly. In India, washermen known as dhobis cleaned clothes in public tanks, beating them against stones with a rhythmic slapping that echoed through the neighborhood. Afterward, garments were spread across large lawns, weighted at the corners with stones. Despite these regional differences, the essential process remained constant: water, fabric, time. The work of cleaning clothing was always a blend of observation, patience, and slow repetition. It was not something done quickly. It could not be hurried. And because it was shared, between women, between families, between generations, it became a kind of quiet bond, one rarely spoken of, yet constantly repeated. The linens dried slowly in the open air. The sound of wind moving through trees mixed with the flapping of clean cloth. Shadows shifted across the grass as the day passed. Nothing rushed, nothing loud, just the long, slow arc of a task that had always been and would always be until the arrival of something new. But long before that future arrived, there was only the stone basin, the cold water, the wooden paddle, and the quiet rhythm of a life lived close to the earth. As evening approached, and the day's washing had been laid to rest upon hedgerows, lines, or flattened grass, the laundress's work did not yet conclude. The final duty was to gather the garments once the sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the yard or the field. Each item was carefully lifted from its resting place, held up to the fading light, and inspected for lingering dampness. A shirt, still cool and heavy to the touch, might be draped again over a chair by the hearth. A length of linen, already crisp from the breeze, would be folded gently and placed in a basket lined with a clean cloth to prevent contact with splinters or dust. Once gathered, these freshly laundered items were returned to the home or storage space with measured steps. Inside the cottage, the hearth glowed with the slow fire of evening kindling. The smell of cooked grain, softened vegetables, and occasionally stewed meat mingled faintly with the lingering dampness of drying wool. It was a clean, earthy aroma, neither perfumed nor pungent. Clothing that was not immediately stored might be draped over wooden chairs or footstools, or even laid across the frame of the bed to finish drying overnight. Within more organized households, clean garments were recorded and returned to specific trunks or chests. A laundress working under a steward or housekeeper might be required to itemize each piece: the number of shirts, underskirts, aprons, linens, and stockings. Some households kept ledgers for this purpose. In neat looping script, an entry might read, "Received 2 white shifts, 4 tablecloths, and 3 lengths of curtain lace, all returned in sound condition, freshly pressed." These notes were seldom dramatic. They were clerical, quiet, and precise. In wealthier environments, pressing was not an afterthought, but a final stage of laundering. Before the invention of the modern flat iron, smoothing was accomplished using stone or glass rollers, warmed bricks wrapped in cloth, or heavy wooden presses. A linen press, often built into cabinetry, used a screw mechanism to apply even pressure between 2 wide wooden boards. Garments or sheets were folded flat, placed between layers of clean cloth, and slowly compressed overnight. This process did not involve heat, but relied on pressure and time to remove creases and impart a sense of order to the finished item. Garments were not typically scented in the modern sense, but a few simple methods of freshening were employed. In Provence and other parts of southern Europe, lavender was harvested and dried in bundles, then stored with linens to lend a subtle fragrance. In England, rosemary and mint were common. In Central Europe, juniper berries or birch leaves were occasionally included among folded cloth. These additions were not merely for scent. Many were believed to deter insects and preserve the integrity of the fabric. Over time, these practices became regional customs, passed along without formal instruction, embedded in the daily acts of maintenance. In many homes, the place where clean laundry was stored was a small but significant area, sometimes no more than a corner cabinet, a carved trunk at the foot of a bed, or a series of shelves built into a recess of the wall. In large houses, linen rooms were established, complete with records and keys, held by a matron or trusted servant. The room itself might be fitted with simple ventilation slats to keep air moving, preventing must and mold. Linens were rotated regularly, oldest used first, to avoid long-term storage. This was a principle not of waste, but of stewardship. The goal was to preserve, reuse, and repair. Occasionally, items would be set aside for whitening. Over time, even the best cared for linens yellowed with use. In the summer months, when the sun was strongest, cloth could be spread upon grass in a process called grassing or bleaching. This practice relied on natural sunlight to draw out discoloration. Linens were dampened, laid flat on clean green spaces, and left for hours or days, turned periodically to expose each side. Dew, sunshine, and air worked together in slow, invisible ways to brighten the fabric. The process was gentle, though it took considerable time and required suitable weather. This concept of seasonal timing was central to pre-industrial laundry. Unlike in the modern era, when washing could be done at will, historic laundering was contingent on weather, temperature, and the availability of water and fuel. Winter laundering in particular posed difficulties. Water froze quickly. Fires took longer to heat large tubs. Drying took days. As such, winter washings were fewer and garments worn more sparingly. Some households maintained 2 sets of heavier clothing, one for daily wear, one for reserve. The latter might be kept in a chest, lined with dried herbs, and sealed with a waxed cloth cover to preserve freshness until needed. In monasteries and religious communities, the laundering of robes and vestments followed its own quiet order. Each member of the brotherhood or sisterhood had an assigned garment, usually marked with initials or a stitch pattern for identification. Washing was done communally, with certain members dedicated to the care of clothing as part of their weekly duties. The work was considered humble and sacred. Silence was often observed. Movements were methodical. Robes were rinsed repeatedly, then dried in cloistered courtyards or open walkways sheltered from rain. Linen altar cloths and sacred linens were washed with special care, often by elder members, in copper basins reserved for no other use. Soap, where available, was not always applied directly to fabric. In the early Middle Ages, what passed for soap was often a soft, pasty mixture of animal fat and ash, stored in pots, and scooped out with wooden spoons. In some regions, soap was imported as a luxury item, firm, greenish cakes of olive oil soap from the Levant or Castile. These were reserved for fine linens or facial cloths. The common people relied primarily on lye, or on local washing clays, or on fermented plant matter such as saponin-rich soapwort, which, when soaked and crushed, created a foamy liquid capable of lifting dirt without damaging fiber. Soapwort, a low-growing herb with soft pink flowers, was cultivated in cottage gardens for just this purpose. Its roots and leaves were harvested and steeped in water, then agitated to produce a gentle lather. Garments were soaked in this solution and stirred with a wooden rod. The scent was faint and herbal, and the method non-abrasive, ideal for wool, silk, or other delicate materials. This method was passed down informally, from mother to daughter, often remembered more by rhythm than by instruction. Even the act of transporting laundry carried its customs. In rural communities, washed garments were carried in large wicker baskets, lined with fabric to prevent snagging. Some baskets had lids, others were covered with cloths secured by weights or knots. In towns, larger loads were moved by barrow, cart, or shoulder yoke. In especially steep or muddy places, paths were reinforced with flat stones to ease the burden of hauling wet, heavy fabric uphill. These stones, worn smooth by foot traffic and wheels, remain in some villages to this day. Despite its physical demands, laundry was not typically regarded as punishment or hardship. It was a necessary part of existence. Even when difficult, it was rarely spoken of in tones of complaint. Those who performed it did so with quiet pride. They knew the proper ratio of ash to water, the right wood to use for paddles, the precise thickness of linen that would dry before nightfall. Their knowledge was not codified in writing, but carried in the hands, in the timing of a glance at the sky, in the memory of a grandmother's words. In cities, where space was limited, laundry required adaptation. Communal washing basins were established in courtyards or near fountains. These were carved from stone, with drainage channels leading away to gutters or sewers. Each household had its day or time slot. Notices were passed verbally or posted on doorways. The city authorities, mindful of hygiene and water usage, sometimes issued ordinances regulating when and how laundry could be washed. For example, in parts of 14th century Paris, washing was forbidden near water sources designated for drinking. In Milan, laundresses had designated zones along the canals. In Bruges, washing houses were attached to almshouses and orphanages, serving multiple functions under one roof. And so it was that across time, geography, and culture, the act of laundering followed its quiet arc. Slow, deliberate, careful. A rhythm woven into the week, into the weather, into the subtle unfolding of domestic life. The soapless days were not unclean, only different. The people did not lack for method, only machines. And though their work was slower, it was not lesser. It was precise, repetitive, and born of quiet understanding. Each basin filled and emptied. Each garment beaten, rinsed, and wrung. Each linen laid to dry, then folded, then stored. This was the history not of invention, but of practice, not of names, but of hands, not of change, but of continuity. The history of laundry before soap and machines is the history of patient, unnoticed labor, quiet, constant, and always beginning again. In regions shaped by mountainous terrain, such as the foothills of the Carpathians or the highlands of northern Spain, laundering took on yet more distinctive forms, shaped as much by topography as by tradition. The descent to the stream could take half an hour or more, and was made cautiously, down narrow switchbacks, or winding paths bordered by stone walls. Baskets of clothing, bundled in cloth or lashed with hemp cord, were carried on backs or across shoulders, often with the aid of wooden yokes designed to balance the weight evenly. These tools, passed down from elder to child, were carved by hand, sometimes with decorative markings, though most were plain and darkened by years of use. At the stream's edge, washing stations had been informally shaped over time. Flat stones were set into the riverbank, or arranged in shallow pools where the current was slow but constant. Small retaining walls of rock and turf might be constructed upstream to hold the flow, raising the waterline slightly to ease the soaking of garments. In particularly cold climates, where even in spring the waters remained frigid, laundresses wore thick skirts and woolen stockings, their sleeves rolled to the elbow, their hands chapped and reddened by contact with the water. The rhythm here was always slow. Each item of clothing, be it a shift, a work smock, a head covering, or a child's undergarment, was treated with quiet care, dipped, twisted, pressed against the stone, lifted and pressed again. Each action was a small act of maintenance, carried out without rush. The movement of hands against fabric, the sound of water falling and rising, the soft murmur of voices passing idle remarks. All of these filled the space with a kind of meditative repetition. Nothing changed quickly, and nothing was expected to. Where families were larger, as in extended farming households, or among those who housed seasonal laborers, laundry became a multi-day endeavor. Monday and Tuesday might be devoted to washing, Wednesday to drying and folding, and Thursday to mending and putting away. In such households, the storage of linens was an organized affair. Large wooden chests, bound in iron, were labeled by purpose: kitchen linens, bedding, garments for winter or for feast days. Each chest was rubbed down with oil or wax periodically to keep the wood from splitting, and lavender or bay leaves were scattered between the folds of cloth. In warmer Mediterranean climates, the sun was a reliable ally. Garments could be dried more quickly, and the availability of olive oil soap allowed for slightly more advanced washing methods. In parts of southern Italy and the Greek islands, soap was made at home in small batches, using oil from the family's own groves, mixed with lye obtained from burnt plant matter. This soap, soft and slightly alkaline, was cut into blocks and dried over weeks. It was not fragrant but effective, and prized for its gentleness on both skin and fiber. In these regions, laundering took place not only by rivers, but also in communal washhouses known as lavatoi, or lavaderos. These structures, roofed but open-walled, provided shade and shelter, and were often located near springs or aqueduct-fed basins. Built of stone, with long shallow troughs, these spaces echoed with the soft slap of fabric, the clink of buckets, and the occasional low laugh. Despite being work, these washhouses offered a place of respite and social exchange. Never hurried, never loud. The communal nature of laundry extended into social norms. Young girls learned the techniques not from written instruction, but from their mothers, aunts, or elder neighbors. The proper way to wring out a linen shirt without twisting the seams, the timing of soaking, based on water temperature, the arrangement of garments on the line to avoid uneven fading, all these were passed down through demonstration and repetition. There was no ceremony to it, simply time and familiarity. In the countryside, laundry was deeply tied to the seasons. Spring brought the first opportunity for outdoor drying after the winter's long damp. Summer allowed for the bleaching of linens and the airing of blankets stored through the cold months. Autumn required preparation. Washing and storing summer garments before the hearth became the primary heat source once again. Winter was lean. Clothes were changed less often. Outer layers were brushed rather than washed, and undergarments were kept as clean as circumstances allowed, with spot washing done by hand near the hearth in small basins of tepid water. Across Asia, laundry traditions mirrored these patterns in both simplicity and repetition. In Korea, households along mountain streams performed weekly laundering using ash water or plant-based rinses. In rural Vietnam, entire families might gather by rice paddies after harvest, washing garments in carefully dug channels where rainwater pooled. In China, elder family members often maintained a careful ledger of linen items, especially in homes with ancestral halls or ceremonial garb. Each item had its season and purpose. Silk robes for festival days were aired and brushed more than washed, and when washing was required, it was done gently, with a silk-wrapped paddle to prevent damage. In the Middle East, the scarcity of water required ingenuity. Clothing was washed less frequently but maintained with brushing, airing, and sun exposure. When water was used, it was often gray water collected from rinsing and reused carefully. Soap made from olive oil and soda ash was more widely available and used sparingly. Laundering often took place early in the morning, before the heat of the day, with fabrics laid flat upon sun-warmed stones to dry quickly and thoroughly. In each of these places, whether in a shaded European glen or a dusty village courtyard, the principles were the same. Remove soil, rinse thoroughly, dry slowly, and preserve for continued use. It was a closed loop, minimal waste, minimal replacement, constant care. Mending was the final and inseparable companion to laundry. A tear spotted during washing was noted and repaired promptly. Needles, threaded with undyed linen or wool, were kept close by. Stitching was simple: straight seams, reinforced edges, darned patches. Woolen socks were particularly prone to wear and were often reinforced with coarser yarn. Undergarments, frequently laundered and thin from use, were patched again and again until the original fabric was nearly obscured. Even this stitching carried its traditions. In some cultures, women marked the inside hem of a garment with a tiny symbol, sometimes a cross, a flower, or an initial, stitched with contrasting thread. These were not decorative, but practical. They indicated ownership, repair history, or simply served as a small token of care. In large households or in shared spaces such as monasteries or boarding schools, such markings ensured that garments could be returned to their proper place. Laundry was not isolated from the rest of domestic life. It was connected to gardening, as certain plants were grown specifically for soap making or pest deterrents. It was connected to cooking, as the same fire that warmed the pot of soup also heated water for soaking. It was connected to child rearing, as children fetched buckets or stirred cooling water, learning through action rather than instruction. It was connected to time itself, not in minutes or hours, but in days and weather and seasons. And so, without machines, without packaged detergents, without digital timers or spinning drums, clothing was kept clean. Not spotless, but clean. Not scented, but fresh. Not wrinkle-free, but neatly folded. Through hands and habit, through patience and repetition, through practices remembered not because they were remarkable, but because they were never forgotten. In those centuries before mechanization, the work of laundering was often invisible to the historical record, yet utterly central to the rhythm of life. The garments washed, dried, and folded day after day, year after year, bore silent witness to daily labor, to rest, to passage through fields and into kitchens, from cradle to grave. The fabrics were not discarded lightly. Even at the end of their usefulness as garments, cloth was preserved and repurposed, cut into cleaning rags, wound into bandages, or sewn into patchwork. Nothing was wasted, because to waste cloth was to waste time, effort, and materials not easily regained. Thus, laundering was not only a physical process, but a philosophical one, a stewardship of textiles that reflected a broader way of interacting with material goods. Clothing was not consumed, it was maintained. Soiled linen did not represent shame or failure, it simply marked the natural course of wear and use. Dirt was not the enemy, but a sign of labor. Washing did not erase toil, but preserved the fabric to endure more of it. In quiet villages of central France, for instance, the lavoir stood as a familiar part of community life. These stone washhouses, sometimes open air, sometimes roofed, were situated by springs or wells, and built with low stone basins, around which women could kneel or sit. Water flowed gently through sluices, sometimes diverted from nearby brooks. The structure echoed with the soft sounds of cloth swishing, paddles tapping, and water flowing. Conversation, if it occurred, was unhurried and subdued, for the work required steady motion and care. In the colder months, straw mats might be brought to cushion knees, and fires might be lit nearby to warm fingers numbed by water. Tools remained remarkably consistent over time. The battoir, a wooden beater used to agitate fabric, was flat, paddle-shaped, often worn smooth from use. In some places it was carved with patterns, not for decoration, but to assist in grip. Washboards, when they appeared, were framed with wood and lined with metal or ridged glass, allowing for friction against smaller articles. Yet many preferred simply the stone and the strength of their own hands, feeling the fabric directly, judging by texture and weight whether the garment was truly clean. The same laundry process shaped the routines of the countryside and the town, though the scale varied. In smaller homes, the task might involve a dozen items. In larger establishments, manor houses, abbeys, or schools, it could mean scores of sheets, uniforms, tablecloths, and undergarments. In such places, laundering was a task divided among several workers, supervised by a laundress-in-chief or a housekeeper, who ensured that the routine progressed smoothly over the course of the week. The weekly routine itself was remarkably standardized in many regions by the 17th century. Monday was typically wash day, chosen not by accident but by tradition. Sunday being the day of rest, the following morning allowed for the gathering and sorting of the week's soiled items. Tuesday and Wednesday were for drying and ironing or pressing. Thursday and Friday were often reserved for mending, folding, and storing. Saturday was for preparation for the Sabbath, and then the cycle would begin again. Linen, so commonly used for undergarments, bedsheets, and table linens, was prized for its ability to withstand repeated laundering. Its strength came from the flax fibers from which it was woven, which, though stiff at first, became softer with washing and age. Unlike wool, which could shrink or felt under agitation, linen became more supple over time, yet its paleness also made it susceptible to staining, and so whitening techniques were cherished. Beyond the laying out in the sun, grassing, as earlier mentioned, some households developed mild bleaching methods, using sour milk, vinegar, or lemon juice applied sparingly and left to dry beneath strong sunlight. In cooler, wetter regions such as parts of the British Isles, these methods were adjusted. Sunshine was less reliable, so drying and whitening were slower. The concept of the drying green persisted, a communal patch of short grass near the edge of a village, fenced, to keep out livestock, where clean linens were laid flat. A woman might visit her linen several times a day, adjusting it, flipping it, checking for dew. Care was taken to ensure no soiling by birds or dust, and if rain threatened, the cloth was gathered and covered promptly. To prevent damage to delicate items, older households developed the habit of placing a thin cloth beneath the item being bleached, often an older piece of linen beyond wearable use. This cloth absorbed stains, moisture, and dirt from the ground. It was a small precaution, but an important one, learned through time and careful observation. Folding was a concluding gesture of care. A shirt was not merely folded to conserve space, but to preserve its structure. There were folding techniques passed through families, once down the middle, then across, sleeves turned inward, collar protected. Tablecloths were folded corner to corner, creating smooth edges that revealed no fray. Some women took pride in perfectly square stacks. Others placed thin strips of wood between layers to maintain evenness. Clean garments were returned to their owners with a quiet sense of pride. In a household with servants, a housekeeper might lay out freshly laundered garments on a bed or place them inside a designated drawer or chest. In homes without servants, the task belonged to the women of the house. Children, especially daughters, learned by assisting, carrying baskets, folding napkins, or pairing socks. These were not chores to be completed, but contributions to the household rhythm. In urban centers, as commerce expanded, a small trade emerged around laundering. Washerwomen took in clothing from families who could afford the service, marked each garment discreetly with thread or chalk, and returned them at the end of the week. To distinguish items, they often used systems of knots or color-coded stitches, one thread color for each household, or a distinct loop sewn into the hem. Payment was modest but consistent, and for many, it provided a necessary income. Some laundresses became well known in their neighborhoods, recognized for their diligence and care. Customers remained loyal, not for price, but for trust. A good laundress preserved the shape of collars, returned handkerchiefs without fray, and remembered which garments required gentler handling. Her tools were few, but well kept. Her schedule, fixed by daylight and weather, was predictable. Her presence, unassuming. The work itself was not glorified. It rarely appeared in portraits or records, except as an aside. Yet it was constant, and without it, life did not proceed. Garments had to be clean not for vanity, but for health, for ritual, for comfort. The table needed a fresh cloth. The child needed a dry shift. The elder needed a sheet unsoiled. These needs did not wait for invention. They were met with hands and water and time. Thus, long before the churn of washing drums or the hum of electric motors, long before the arrival of detergent boxes and softener bottles, there was only the basin, the river, the tub. There was ash and straw and soap root. There was steam rising from a pot, hands wringing cold cloth, and sunlight slowly drying linen stretched across a rope. There was no rush, only routine, only practice, only care. And when the day ended, and the garments were clean and stored, the paddles hung neatly on the wall, the buckets tipped to dry, the fire damped for the night, there remained only the stillness of a home ready to begin again, quietly, steadily, as it always had. In some households, especially those situated in cooler or wetter climates, the seasonality of laundry shaped the very design of the home. In northern Germany, parts of Scandinavia, and the Scottish Highlands, homes were occasionally constructed with enclosed porches or dedicated lean-to spaces attached to the main structure. These were not ornate or elaborate, but functional additions, often no more than stone-floored rooms with high windows and slatted vents for airflow, designed specifically for tasks such as laundering, brewing, and drying herbs. In the absence of consistent sunlight or dry air outdoors, such spaces allowed laundry to be dried slowly over several days near the warmth of the hearth or stove, protected from mist and rain. Ropes were strung from wall to wall or across wooden beams, and garments were draped with care. If multiple batches of washing were necessary, heavier garments such as woolen cloaks and work trousers were dried close to the fire, while lighter linens were hung nearer the vents to allow airflow. The smell within such spaces was distinct, a mixture of moisture, smoke, and the earthy scent of fabric that had known hard labor. Tools were kept nearby. Pegs, made from smoothed twigs or carved bone, hung from simple racks. A wooden stool might serve as a resting place for a basin. A flat stone warmed beside the fire could be used for pressing collars or smoothing folds. These spaces were not decorative, but well tended. They represented continuity, the physical space where one performed the same actions one's mother and grandmother had performed before. Even in the manor houses and larger dwellings of the gentry, such practical spaces existed, though concealed from view. Beneath the kitchens, adjacent to the servants' quarters, the laundry rooms were often among the largest workrooms of the house. Large copper tubs were built into brick hearths, where water could be heated directly by fire. Long wooden tables lined the walls for folding and sorting. The walls were hung with paddles, tongs, sieves, and wooden stirring rods. Metal hooks held baskets from the ceiling to protect drying herbs and bundles of soft cloth. In these grander households, the laundering staff might include several individuals, each with a distinct task. The washerwoman, who handled the soaking and beating of garments, the wringer, who twisted excess water from heavy cloths, the dryer, who monitored the hanging and turning of items, and the presser, who, with glass weights or warm stones, prepared clothing for wear. Above them all stood the housekeeper, who ensured that nothing was misplaced, that colors were not run, and that the linen inventory remained complete. Each member of the staff knew the value of the textiles under their care. Bedding, in particular, demanded great attention. Mattresses were not washed, but aired. Feather beds were shaken and fluffed in the open air on fine days, then covered again in thick ticking. Sheets and pillowcases, typically made of linen, were laundered more frequently. In some households, clean sheets were warmed before use, either by hanging them by the hearth or laying them briefly over heated board, especially in winter months. Such gestures were not signs of indulgence, but of consideration and care. In rural hamlets, where such amenities were rare, the care for bed linens was simpler, but no less deliberate. Blankets were brushed with bundled twigs to remove dust and aired over fences or thatch roofs on dry days. Quilts and coverlets were turned inside out and hung with stones placed at the corners to keep them from catching wind. When rains threatened, women would check the skies repeatedly, listening to the shift of wind, the call of birds, the smell in the air that signaled change. Timing was everything. For those whose livelihood depended on laundering, there were small economies built around the task. In some towns, itinerant washerwomen traveled from village to village, staying for a few days in exchange for a place to sleep, a meal, and a modest wage. These women were known by name, welcomed into homes with familiarity. They carried their own paddles, their own soap, and in some cases, small bottles of infused oil or dried herbs to scent garments as a mark of their service. The rise of communal wash houses in the 18th and 19th centuries formalized what had long been informal. Municipal authorities in some towns recognized the need for shared spaces where water could be used efficiently and garments cleaned hygienized. And these wash houses, roof structures with long stone basins, often became places not only of work, but of quiet society. Notices were posted regarding hours of use. Tools could be borrowed for a fee. Water was diverted and drained with care. The tone was orderly, predictable, quiet. In these spaces, even the passage of time felt subdued. A washerwoman might arrive with the first light of morning, unpack her bundles, light a small stove if permitted, and set to work with minimal conversation. The sounds were soft, wood on stone, water on fabric, the shift of feet against wet floor. Hours passed with little change. Meals, when taken, were modest. Bread, a wedge of cheese, a flask of watered wine, or ale. Work resumed and continued until the light grew dim or the basin grew too cold to bear. Through all this, there remained an understanding that laundering, though repetitive was not meaningless. So it brought rhythm to the week, order to the home, and dignity to the individual. Clothing was not merely decorative, it was functional, protective, and in its quiet way, expressive. To clean it, to maintain it, to fold and store it with care, these were acts of reverence for daily life. Few of these practices were written down in great detail at the time. They were considered too ordinary, too self-evident, yet in their ordinariness lay a remarkable consistency. Across cultures, from highlands to lowlands, from deserts to river valleys, people laundered their clothes with water, time, and intention. They waited for the sun. They warmed their fingers by the fire. They tested the fabric with a practiced touch. They stitched and pressed and folded. The laundry was done not once and for all, but always again. The moment a garment was cleaned, it began again its journey toward soiling. This cycle was not resented. It was simply understood. It was a rhythm as old as habitation, as quiet as dusk, as steady as breath. And so it continued, day after day, week after week, across centuries. 1,000 variations, but one essence, the humble, silent art of keeping clothing clean, without soap, without machinery, without haste. In many ways, the practice of laundry before the advent of soap and machines served as a quiet testament to humanity's adaptability and attentiveness to environment. Climate, geography, and local resources shaped how the task was approached in each region, but the foundational steps remained universally recognizable: soaking, agitation, rinsing, drying, folding, and storing. Each phase was carried out with a rhythm that did not change from year to year or even century to century, except in the slowest increments. Innovation came not in leaps, but in refinements, a new way to suspend a drying line, a more efficient angle for a washboard, a more balanced formula for ashlie. In North Africa, for instance, in oases and desert towns where water was especially precious, The laundering of garments took place less frequently, but with great care. Clothing was maintained with brushing and sun exposure, and when washing occurred, it was done communally in deep cisterns or shallow channels dug near wells. The water was reused across multiple rinsings, beginning with the least soiled garments and ending with those requiring the greatest attention. Soap, where used, was made from olive or argan oil mixed with soda ash or potash and dried in the sun into hard brown cakes. The scent was mild, sometimes smoky, sometimes slightly medicinal, but not perfumed. The garments themselves reflected local customs and needs. Loose-fitting robes, often of cotton or wool, were constructed for easy washing and airflow. Undergarments were fewer, replaced more by layers of draping and wrapping than by tightly fitted clothing. In such environments, the sun itself was the most powerful cleanser, both bleaching and drying garments on rooftop lines or open courtyards paved with pale stone that retained the heat of the day long after sunset. In the Andean highlands of South America, laundry was performed in icy streams flowing down from glacial melt. The water was clear, frigid, and fast-moving, and laundering was performed quickly but methodically. Woolen garments made from alpaca or llama hair were soaked and pressed rather than beaten to avoid matting the fibers. Indigenous women developed techniques using flat river stones, against which the garments were pressed and rubbed. Soap was rare. Instead, a plant known locally for its cleansing properties, sometimes a saponin-rich root or bark, was used. The foam produced was minimal, but sufficient. In each of these places and countless others, laundry required not only labor, but observation. A woman would observe the clarity of the water, the presence of plant matter, the movement of light across the drying cloth. She would note when a hem began to fray, or when a patch required reinforcement. She would feel with her hands whether a piece was fully rinsed or still held residue. The fingers served as guides more reliable than sight. There were no thermometers, no dials, no timers, only judgment built over years of repetition. This sensory knowledge passed quietly through generations. Grandmothers taught their granddaughters not through speech, but through gesture, demonstrating how to twist a cloth without straining its seams, how to fold it to prevent creases, how to secure it to a line so it would not sag. These movements became second nature, rarely questioned, rarely altered. In many communities, they were performed with a kind of meditative stillness, the body moving through familiar motions, while the mind drifted in soft reflection. Clothing, meanwhile, was not changed daily. In most regions before industrialization, garments were worn for several days, sometimes longer, before being washed. Undergarments were changed more often than outer garments. Bed linens were washed perhaps every few weeks. Heavier items such as cloaks and coats were brushed and aired, but seldom soaked, unless soiled. And even when washed, garments were not expected to look new. A well-maintained piece bore the marks of wear gracefully, slightly faded seams, minor patchwork, the soft texture of aged linen. Ironing or pressing was likewise approached with simplicity. In the absence of modern irons, smoothing was done using flat stones warmed near the hearth, or with small metal pans filled with embers, moved carefully over a folded cloth. In Asia, glass or porcelain rollers were used. Cylindrical tools rolled back and forth over the fabric with steady pressure. Wooden blocks weighted with stones could also be used, especially for large items such as tablecloths or bedding. These tools required no electricity, only patience and balance. As for organization, larger households developed systems to track and manage their linen. Linen rooms, cool, dark, and dry, were maintained with shelves and hooks, baskets, and ledgers. Items were labeled by type: bath linens, hand towels, undergarments, bedding, ceremonial cloths. Each was stored according to rotation, with the oldest or most frequently used items placed at the top of the stack. Some households employed a numbering system, sewing small tags into the seams or corners to track wear. Others relied on routine and the familiarity of the staff. Even among the poorest households, order was maintained. A single basket might hold all the family's linens, but within it, items were grouped and folded with care. In a world without abundance, Preservation became a habit. Laundry was not the pursuit of cleanliness for its own sake, but a practice of respect for labor, for materials, for continuity. It was not flamboyant or fast. It was enduring, steady, and reliable. In monasteries and religious institutions, this philosophy was formalized. Silence often accompanied the work. The washing of robes, altar cloths, and bedding was undertaken in accordance with a schedule that aligned with the calendar of feasts and fasts. Vestments were cleaned in specific ways, with designated tools and spaces. Ash lye was filtered through fine linen before use. Water was drawn at particular hours. Each task was imbued with calm deliberation. In Eastern Europe, especially in the lands that bordered great rivers such as the Danube or the Volga, laundresses gathered at designated riverbanks to perform their work. These spots were known by name in the local dialects and passed down through oral history. Stone steps led down to the water's edge, and flat stones were arranged in careful alignment for kneeling or pressing. In winter, holes were cut in the ice to allow access to the river's flow, though washing was minimal at such times. More commonly, winter laundry was limited to small rinsings and the brushing of woolens indoors. Throughout these regions, the drying of laundry became an art in itself. In the Baltic states, high wooden racks were constructed in courtyards and fields, designed to hold many garments at once. These racks, resembling small fences or trellises, allowed airflow and light to pass freely. Lines were strung between them with natural cordage, hemp or flax, chosen for its resistance to stretching and rot. Garments were clipped or pinned using wooden pegs carved by hand. These pegs, too, had their subtle variations. In some areas, they were springless, crafted from a single folded piece of wood bound with twine. In others, they were simple wedges pressed between garment and line. Children sometimes carved faces into old pegs, using them for play once they had lost their grip. Broken pegs were repurposed as kindling. Nothing was wasted. The return of clean laundry to the household was conducted without ceremony, yet with quiet satisfaction. To pull a freshly laundered shift over one's head, to lie between clean sheets, to place a folded cloth on a dining table, these were small comforts, deeply familiar, rarely spoken of aloud, but recognized by all. They marked the completion of a cycle, not an accomplishment, but a fulfillment. And once the laundry was returned, the tools were put away. The tub was rinsed and dried. The paddle leaned against its usual wall. The baskets were nested. The drying lines, slack and empty, awaited the next load. The house, once again, grew still. The air held the faint scent of soap root or smoke, of damp wool, of sun-dried linen. Nothing flashy, only the smell of work done. Outside, the sky shifted into dusk. The birds quieted. The fields darkened. The day drew to a close, as all days did. And somewhere, in another home not far off, another basin was filled, another garment soaked, another set of hands prepared to begin again. Within the boundaries of these older rhythms, where laundry occupied a fixed and unquestioned place in the week, its presence threaded itself through other domestic routines in seamless, unhurried ways. When the hearth was lit not for cooking, but for warming water, when rain barrels were emptied, not for irrigation, but for soaking garments, when the yard filled not with voices, but with the slow motion of fabric lifted and pinned, the home itself subtly reoriented to the task at hand. In alpine villages, the practice of seasonal laundry emerged as a necessity born of climate and topography. These highland communities, subject to heavy snowfall in the winter and brief warm summers, approached washing not as a weekly occurrence, but as a periodic undertaking. Great linen washings were sometimes held only 2 or 3 times per year, once in spring, again in late summer, and finally in autumn, before the snows returned. These events were known by local names, often tied to the feast days around which they clustered, and they were marked not by celebration, but by preparation. In such communities, entire households worked together. The linen was sorted by weight and use, finer items such as shirts and aprons in one pile, bedding and tablecloths in another, heavier woolens in a third. The washing area was cleared, a space beside a mountain stream or near the village's communal fountain. Ashes were sifted and lye water prepared in advance, using rainwater filtered through straw and collected in wooden barrels. The vessels used for soaking were hauled out from storage, shallow wooden troughs or large tubs lined with smooth river stones to help with abrasion. Over several days, the garments were soaked, scrubbed, and rinsed in stages. The work began early and ended late. Meals were simple, often eaten, standing, bread dipped in broth, and shared among all. Hands were blistered by the cold. The garments, once washed, were hung on long wooden frames, or laid upon flat stones warmed by the sun. Children might be tasked with turning them or with chasing away birds. In the evenings, the clean cloths were brought inside or under cover, folded loosely to prevent creasing, and finished indoors. This method, though less frequent, was no less precise. In fact, it required more care, as each item had to be preserved for long stretches between cleanings. The garments were stored between layers of dried herbs or sweet grasses. Sheets were aired monthly. Woolens were brushed and folded tightly to discourage pests. And as each item was returned to its shelf or chest, it was examined, mended if needed, and marked discreetly for its next use. In Eastern Christian monasteries, especially those located in the wooded territories of Ruthenia and Moldavia, the laundering of liturgical vestments followed centuries-old customs. Robes and altar linens were washed only by designated monastics, often older brethren whose tasks had turned from field work to domestic duties. These garments were handled with reverence, folded in ritualized patterns, and dried not on lines, but laid flat across polished wooden boards. Rinsing water was not discarded carelessly, but poured upon the earth in quiet corners of the garden, as it was considered to have touched sacred items. The space in which this laundering occurred was kept plain: flagstone floors, whitewashed walls, and unadorned wooden basins. Silence was maintained, not for solemnity alone, but because the labor itself was slow and required patience. There was no haste, only the slow turn of cloth in water, the quiet dripping from a newly wrung hem, and the muted scuff of leather sandals upon stone. Similarly, in early Ottoman households, particularly those located in the inland regions of Anatolia, the laundering of garments, especially the delicate fabrics such as muslin and silk, was done primarily by hand in sunlit courtyards, enclosed by high walls. Buckets were drawn from private cisterns. Soap was handmade, typically from olive oil mixed with wood ash, and sometimes perfumed with rose water or bay laurel. These cakes were stored on shelves near the washing area, kept dry and out of reach of household animals. The garments themselves were agitated gently in large ceramic bowls or hammered copper basins. Coarser clothing was pounded lightly with broad wooden mallets, but fine garments were pressed and swirled with bare hands. Rinsing was done with ladles, pouring clean water over the cloth in slow, measured streams until no residue remained. Then, the items were draped across low lines strung between fig trees or woven trellises, the shadows from the foliage dappling the fabric as it dried. A special cloth known as a kamasher urdusu, a laundry cover, was sometimes used to protect drying garments from dust or falling leaves. This cover was a large, loosely woven linen sheet, often older and patched, kept specifically for this purpose. It was weighted at the corners with small stones or tied down with strips of fabric and spread over lighter garments during the drying process. In nearly every culture, the care of laundry extended into the night. After drying, before folding, garments were often aired indoors. In winter, this was done by placing garments near the fire, not too close as to scorch them, but close enough to drive out remaining moisture. Some families kept large wooden racks suspended from the rafters above the hearth where clothes could be hoisted upward using rope and pulley. The warmest air, rising naturally, dried the clothing overnight while preserving floor space below. Laundering tools were not just functional, but personal. A woman's paddle might be handed down to her daughter upon marriage. A soap mold, carved by a grandfather from cherry wood, might be used for generations. These items, though unremarkable to outsiders, bore the patina of memory. Their handles were smooth from decades of use, their edges softened, chipped, but never discarded. In homes without inheritance of land or coin, These quiet objects of labor carried lineage. And even the waste from laundering was carefully managed. Water that had been used for soaking or rinsing was often poured out at the edge of gardens, where the ash content acted as a mild fertilizer. Leftover lye, if filtered, might be used for scrubbing pots or cleaning surfaces. The cloths that were beyond saving, threadbare, riddled with holes, were torn into strips and woven into rugs, twisted into ropes, or used as tinder for the hearth. Within the home, the presence of clean laundry brought with it a sense of peace. The smell of dried linen, faintly earthy and touched by wind, lingered in sleeping quarters. The sight of neatly folded garments resting on a bench or inside a basket was a signal of readiness, that the household was prepared for the next day, the next meal, the next storm. It is easy, in the modern era, to forget the labor once tied to such outcomes. The smooth sheets and fresh clothes that now emerge from machines once passed through hours of careful handling. Before spin cycles and scented detergents, there were only buckets, fingers, stones, fire, and time. Yet this older rhythm, measured not in minutes but in seasons, was not resented. It was simply accepted, part of the life of the home. And in its constancy, there was comfort. As night settled across the village, the drying lines stood empty. The buckets rested. The tools were stacked in corners. And somewhere, in the back of the house, beneath the soft creak of a timber beam, a woman sat folding one last garment in the hush of lamplight. The laundry was finished, for now. Tomorrow, the world would begin again. In the broader rhythm of the year, laundering maintained its quiet place among the many recurring duties that structured pre-industrial life. Much like planting in spring, preserving in summer, harvesting in autumn, and repairing tools in winter, the washing and tending of garments followed a cyclical logic rooted in both necessity and available opportunity. The process was not just about cleanliness, it was about stewardship, and in many ways, about rhythm itself. The rhythm of water, of labor, of breath, of days. Among seafaring communities, the rhythms of laundry were further shaped by the sea itself. In fishing villages scattered along the Atlantic and North Sea coasts, households timed their washing according to tides, winds, and weather forecasts passed down by word of mouth or recorded on scratched wooden calendars nailed near the hearth. When the wind blew salt inland and the tides were high, laundry was postponed. When a rare stretch of still, dry weather came, the entire community took to washing. Here, seawater played a curious dual role. While unsuitable for rinsing due to its salinity, it was sometimes used in the initial soaking of coarse linens or fishing garments to loosen grime before a final rinse with collected rainwater or water drawn from inland wells. The salt served as a mild abrasive and deodorizer, though its overuse and kenchao the garments, once cleaned, were laid flat on dunes or pinned across boat rails turned into makeshift drying racks. Gull feathers, small fish scales, and stray rope fibers sometimes found their way onto the cloth, removed gently before folding. Sailcloth, heavy and prone to mildew, required specialized attention. It was not laundered often, but when it was soaked for days in wide wooden vats, stirred with poles, and hung for several days to dry. These operations were communal, requiring many hands, and they took place in designated yards near the docks where the smell of tar, hemp, and salt mixed with the damp scent of waterlogged fabric. Even the preparation of laundry tools varied according to region and resource. In Central Europe, families carved their own washing paddles, known variously as klopstock, battoir, or klopfer, from hardwoods like beech, ash, or oak. These were often shaped with handles tailored to the grip of the user, and some were adorned with symbols or initials. In some traditions, the gifting of a new paddle marked a girl's coming of age or engagement, a practical object imbued with quiet significance. In southern Russia and the steppes of the east, nomadic and semi-nomadic communities adapted the laundering process to their migratory lifestyles. Water sources were sparse, and garments were fewer, more layered and more robust. Cleaning methods focused heavily on brushing, beating, and airing rather than soaking. Felted wool, commonly used in outer garments, was particularly sensitive to agitation and required delicate handling. Clothing was sometimes buried under warm sand or snow for deodorizing, a process believed to draw out moisture and smells through natural insulation. When washing was possible, it was done in rivers during the warmer months, using flat stones and hand-wrung twisting methods learned through generations of observation. The concept of scent, in laundry, was subtle and never overwhelming. Strong perfumes were rare, and often considered wasteful or inappropriate, especially among the working classes and within religious communities. Instead, fresh scents came from the environment: sunlight, wind, herbs, and the clean neutrality of ash. Occasionally, linen closets held sachets of dried flowers: chamomile, lavender, elderflower. These were changed seasonally and placed in corners of the storage space to keep away insects and lend a pleasant, unobtrusive aroma. A freshly opened linen chest in spring might carry with it the soft trace of a distant harvest. The management of insect damage was also a part of the laundering cycle. In regions prone to moths or beetles, protective measures were taken during storage. Cedarwood shavings were scattered among folds. Leaves from walnut or bay trees were layered between stacked items. Occasionally, a piece of cloth was dipped in vinegar and dried before being stored among more delicate pieces. These practices were regional and often the result of long local experience rather than formal instruction. They were part of the lore of laundry, passed from elder to youth, embedded in the gestures of care. Over time, the repetition of laundering left physical traces, not only on garments but on the tools, the spaces, and the hands that performed it. Wooden paddles grew smooth. Wicker baskets softened and sagged with use. The basin's interior wore a faint groove from years of rinsing. The floor beneath the drying line darkened slightly from the slow drip of water. The laundress's hands bore the marks of her trade: skin cracked in winter, calluses at the base of the fingers, a faint scent of ash and wool that lingered even after rest. Yet there was also an economy of motion in these practiced hands. A woman who had done laundry for many years could twist a cloth evenly with a single movement, could detect the right weight of dampness in the palm of her hand, could fold a sheet in quarters with precision even in dim light. These were not celebrated skills. They were simply lived. Among the elderly, as hands grew weaker and the bending and lifting became more difficult, assistance was quietly provided. Younger family members would take over the heavier tasks, hauling buckets, beating heavier cloth, while the elder would remain near, tending to smaller items, folding, or overseeing. In this, too, there was continuity. The elder passed down not instruction, but presence. Her gaze guided the process more than her words. As the seasons shifted, so too did the textiles under care. In spring, lighter linens were washed and aired, prepared for warmer weather. In autumn, heavier bedding was brought out, brushed, and unfolded. With the first frost, woolen underlayers were checked for moth holes and aired near the fire. Each season had its laundry work, and each item had its time. The cloth itself aged. Over years, even the most durable linen frayed at the edges. Some items were patched repeatedly, so that a single garment bore the stitches of multiple generations. A child's shift might become a cleaning cloth. A tablecloth, once too stained for display, might be used as a lining or repurposed into a curtain. Fabrics were not disposed of lightly. The transformation was a form of continuity, a sign that nothing was finished until it was truly beyond use. And still, despite its constancy, the work of laundering remained largely invisible to the world beyond the home. It was not recorded in ledgers unless part of paid employment. It was not illustrated in fine paintings. It was not celebrated in song or poetry. It was simply done, quietly, regularly, without fail. Evenings after laundering were subdued, the fatigue of the day, the scent of drying cloth, the satisfaction of clean garments folded and returned to their place, these made for a particular kind of rest, one not of idleness, but of completion. The hearth glowed softly, and beside it the last of the laundry tools might be stacked neatly, the floor still damp in patches, the air gently humid. Somewhere beyond the cottage wall, night settled into its own rhythm, and within, all was still. Tomorrow would bring another task, but for now, the laundry was clean, and that was enough. In households where space was limited, the organization of clean laundry required ingenuity and quiet discipline. Shelving was often improvised, small nooks carved into plaster walls, wooden slats affixed between beams, or chests that served dual purposes as both seating and storage. Larger homes might possess armoires or linen presses, but in cottages and modest dwellings, it was more common to store folded garments in baskets made of willow, hazel, or rye straw. These baskets, sometimes lidded and sometimes left open, were lined with scraps of older linen to keep out dust and splinters. Each item was placed in a particular order, with heavier cloth at the bottom, lighter items at the top, and often a sprig of dried herb tucked gently between layers. The folding of garments, too, had its conventions. Bed linens were folded to a standard width, matching the dimensions of the shelf or chest in which they were kept. This made stacking more stable and ensured the fabric would not crease excessively during storage. Towels and handkerchiefs were often rolled rather than folded to save space and preserve their edges. Delicate items, such as embroidered napkins or lace-edged collars, were interleaved with plain cloth to prevent catching or fraying. The act of folding was neither rushed nor ornamental. It was simply one more step in a long, deliberate process. Among those who served in larger households or estates, the care of linens was often formalized into systems. The head laundress, or in some cases the housekeeper, maintained a record of how many items were in use, how often they were laundered, and how many had become unfit for service. These records were kept in bound ledgers with dates, initials, and plain notations, 2 pillow slips worn at edge, or 1 tablecloth stained with wine, treated with ash and vinegar. These notes were reviewed not for fault, but for order, ensuring that the household's inventory remained sufficient and that nothing was misplaced. Linen marked for disposal was rarely discarded in the modern sense. Instead, it entered into a second life as rags for cleaning, polishing, or use in the still room. In some households, especially those in the countryside, strips of older fabric were saved for bandaging or for use in childbirth, when clean, soft cloth was essential. In towns, washerwomen sometimes sold bundles of worn but clean cloth to tinkerers, shoemakers, or glaziers, who used the material for their trades. A single sheet, used beyond repair, might still find usefulness in 10 or 12 smaller tasks before being burned as kindling in the hearth. In households with children, laundry routines carried extra steps. Infants required frequent changing, and their cloths, diapers, wraps, bibs, and underthings, were soaked and washed separately, often with extra rinses and without strong lye. Some mothers used chamomile or plantain in the rinse water, believing it softened the cloth and calmed the skin. In warmer months, baby linens were dried in sunlight, with particular care taken to keep them off the ground. A clean plank of wood, or a tightly stretched rope, provided the space needed to keep these garments aloft, and a gentle breeze helped to finish the task. Children, as they grew, were gradually introduced to laundering tasks. A girl of 6 or 7 might be asked to sort clean laundry, to carry dry items from the line, or to fold handkerchiefs. By 10, she might assist with rinsing or spreading garments to dry. Boys, too, sometimes helped with hauling water or chopping wood to heat the tubs, especially in smaller households where each pair of hands mattered. These early contributions were not named as chores, but simply as part of the rhythm of life, absorbed through repetition and modeled by example. In years of drought, when water was scarce, households adapted further. Rainwater was collected with more care, stored in barrels shaded by overhanging roofs, and drawn sparingly for soaking. Washing was reduced to essential items only, and garments were aired and brushed more frequently. A clean appearance was maintained through effort rather than volume. Shaking, brushing, spot washing, and pressing with warm stones. Even without water, cleanliness remained a goal, and no one expected perfection, only diligence. During times of illness, laundering became a matter of great importance. In the presence of fevers or outbreaks, cloth was boiled, sometimes for hours, and then dried flat in full sun whenever possible. In monasteries, infirmary linens were washed separately with their own tools and basins. The rinse water, believed to carry illness, was disposed of away from gardens and wells. Soap, if available, was reserved for these tasks, and the cloth was often marked or set aside to distinguish it from general household linens. The practice of communal laundry also gave rise to social norms that governed behavior at shared washhouses and riversides. Space was respected. Buckets and tubs were not borrowed without permission. Strong lye or soap was kept away from others' garments unless consent was given. Women often maintained informal hierarchies. Those who arrived early chose their stones or benches first, and newcomers observed this quiet order. Arguments were rare, and when they occurred were usually settled with few words and long silences. In winter, laundry slowed almost to a halt in colder regions. Washing large loads was impractical, and drying outdoors was impossible. Indoor laundering was limited to underclothes and small linens. These were washed in heated water near the hearth, and dried on lines strung across the kitchen, between chairs, or from beams overhead. The smell of damp cloth mingled with smoke, cooking odors, and the faint sweetness of drying herbs. Larger items, blankets, outer garments, were brushed and aired in whatever sunlight could be found. Special care was taken not to wet garments unnecessarily in cold weather, as they could freeze solid in minutes. A sheet left outside too long might become stiff as a board, cracking if bent. Children were warned not to touch the wet cloth with bare hands in freezing temperatures, lest their skins stick to the icy fabric. Laundry, in these months, became more about preservation than cleanliness, keeping garments dry, usable, and intact until spring brought water and sun once more. When spring arrived, the first major laundry of the year was often a full-day affair. Known in many regions as spring washing, it involved the stripping of beds, the airing of feather mattresses, the boiling of linens, and the beating of woolens. Fires were stoked before dawn. Water was drawn in great quantity. The household shifted its focus to the task entirely. Meals were simple and eaten on the move. Children were sent to collect firewood or help turn garments on the drying lines. And by evening, the house was filled with the unmistakable scent of ash, sun, and fabric, clean and new again. This pattern repeated year after year, with only subtle variations. The names changed. The tools evolved slowly, but the gestures remained the same. Hands plunged into warm water. Cloth was wrung and folded. Garments were laid flat, turned, and lifted again. The silence of the task was its defining feature. No fanfare, no rush, only the steady progress of clean to soiled and back again. And in the fading light of evening, after all had been gathered, folded, and put away, the tools leaned quietly in corners. A single basket rested by the hearth. A folded towel lay atop a chest, and beyond the window, the line swayed gently, empty now, waiting for the next rhythm to begin. In the broader view of history, the work of laundering before the age of industrialization stands as a vast, unrecorded text, written not in ink, but in water and steam, in fabric worn thin, and in hands roughened by labor. It is a history composed not of battles or edicts, but of folding lines, wooden basins, and the hush of early mornings, spent in quiet repetition. It is the story of ordinary maintenance, of order created and recreated, without applause or monument. Across cultures and centuries, the act of cleaning cloth by hand involved tools that changed little. The washing bat, the tub, the line, the pin, and the basket formed a kit recognizable in medieval Europe, in ancient Asia, in colonial America. Where natural resources differed, substitutions arose, but the basic sequence of action, soak, beat, rinse, dry, remained constant. It was a choreography enacted again and again, day after day, without spectacle. In colonial North America, laundry echoed European patterns, but adjusted for conditions of settlement and self-reliance. Water was drawn from wells or streams and heated over open hearths. Soap was homemade, typically from lard or tallow, mixed with strong lye, leached from hardwood ashes. Early settlers knew the process well, having brought it with them, and it was quickly adapted to the materials available in the New World. Soap was stored in barrels, cut into chunks as needed, and often gritty, harsh, and unscented, yet it served the purpose. Wash day often began at first light. The fire was kindled, the kettles filled. Water took time to heat, especially in large quantities. The garments, sorted the day before, were placed in wooden tubs and soaked in warm water and soap solution. Shirts, stockings, petticoats, aprons, and handkerchiefs were washed first. Heavier bedding and work clothes followed. The heaviest items were sometimes washed outside, where more space allowed for more vigorous scrubbing. As in other traditions, the laundry line, simple rope strung between posts or trees, was a vital tool. Garments were pinned or looped, always arranged with thought. Heavier items on the line ends for balance, lighter items in the center to prevent sag. In some regions, 2 parallel lines were used with a supporting pole, so that the load could be raised or lowered depending on weather and reach. Pegs were whittled from scrap wood, sometimes carved with initials to prevent mix-ups in communities where lines were shared. In winter, the routine changed little in structure, but greatly in effort. Water was still needed, fires still built, garments still washed, but drying became a challenge. Indoor drying was slow, and many homes lacked adequate space. As a result, laundry might take days to complete, with garments draped over chairs, hung near the fireplace, or laid flat across planks propped above the stove. The scent of damp wool and soap smoke became part of the winter air. Laundry, in this context, was not only domestic labor, it was frontier survival. Garments worn repeatedly during field work or travel needed care to last. Mending was essential. Tiers were sewn promptly. Socks were darned. Buttons, often handmade from bone or wood, were reattached before washing to avoid loss. Each item was tracked with care, as the cost of replacement was high. In some households, clothing was inventoried each season, and alterations made by hand in dim evening light. Among enslaved populations in the American South, laundry took on yet another form: forced labor conducted under supervision, often for entire plantations. Large quantities of household linens and clothing were laundered in outdoor yards, with water drawn from wells and heated in iron cauldrons. Soap was made on site. Lines were strung between trees or across porches. The work was difficult and unending, performed in all weather. Yet even here, systems emerged: routines to track garments, methods to minimize fabric damage, techniques to maximize efficiency while reducing fatigue. The knowledge passed between hands, quiet, uncelebrated, but enduring. Elsewhere in the world, regional variations continued to reflect local environments. In the river towns of Southeast Asia, washing was often performed while standing knee-deep in water, garments rinsed and beaten against flat rocks or wooden planks set at the river's edge. In parts of West Africa, washing was a communal act, done in streams or at large wash pits, with rhythmic motion and soft song. Plant-based soaps, sometimes ground into pastes or powders, were used according to availability, and garments were laid to dry on warm stones or woven mats. In Japan, especially in rural areas during the Edo period, laundering was done beside irrigation canals or in small tubs within the home. Soap was uncommon. Instead, rice water or ash water was used to loosen soil from cloth. Fine silk garments were cleaned with particular delicacy, wrapped in cloth to prevent stretching and pressed between boards rather than wrung. The garments, once dry, were stored wrapped in mulberry paper or inside wooden chests, with dried herbs to protect against insects. The entire process was carried out with quiet precision, reflecting broader cultural values of care and restraint. The preservation of garments across decades relied not only on the act of washing, but on the decisions made between washings. Clothing was brushed, shaken, and folded with care. Outer garments were aired regularly, especially in spring and autumn. Kasruwa such as scarves and caps were spot cleaned or refreshed with scented cloths. Shoes were wiped and dried, their linings pulled out and exposed to the air. Maintenance was constant, understated, and effective. As fabrics aged, their textures changed. Linen became softer, almost silken. Wool developed a sheen where it was touched most. Cotton thinned but held its weave. These changes were not flaws but signs of care. Garments that had been laundered and tended for many years were prized, familiar, fitted to the body, remembered by touch. In some homes, these garments outlived their wearers. A shirt, carefully folded, might remain in a drawer for years, kept for memory. A tablecloth might be brought out only on special occasions, ironed and laid flat with the same reverence as before. A handkerchief, embroidered and stored in lavender, might pass from one generation to the next. And in this way, laundering extended beyond utility into tradition. It was not spoken of in formal terms. It was rarely written about, but it remained, the quiet work that accompanied every life, behind every meal, every sleep, every journey. A rhythm so constant that it became invisible, yet essential. The line swayed in the breeze, the garments dried, the water cooled, and somewhere, a hand reached to fold once more. In the villages of northern Italy, particularly in the rural stretches of Emilia-Romagna and the Veneto, laundering was embedded into the very design of daily paths. Many older homes were constructed near slow-flowing canals or irrigation ditches, used both for agriculture and household needs. A short walk from the home, perhaps past the vineyard or olive grove, led to a lavatoio, a small stone basin built with low walls and a slightly inclined floor to allow water to drain. It was roofed with red tiles and open on the sides to let in air. Though public, it was seldom crowded. Women arrived at their usual hour, placed their bundles in order, and began their work with quiet repetition. Water was drawn by hand, using ladles carved from gourd or wood. Soap was prepared at home, often during winter months, in large batches. The process required patience. Animal fats were slowly rendered and mixed with alkaline lechet from ash. The mixture was stirred over low heat and then poured into molds or trays to set. Once hardened, the soap was cut into blocks and left to cure for weeks. It had no fragrance except the slight neutral smell of ash and lard. When used, it created only a thin film, not foam, and was applied sparingly to conserve the precious stock. A typical laundering session began with soaking. Garments were unwrapped from their bundles and sorted. Everyday linen, finer items, woolens, and heavily soiled cloth. The lighter fabrics were soaked first, allowing the water to remain relatively clean for the more delicate work. Each item was submerged and pressed gently with flat hands. Only later, after soaking, were garments scrubbed, pressed against the washboard, or beaten lightly with the wooden paddle. In these sessions, speech was minimal. When it occurred, it flowed softly and without interruption to the task. The drying process was timed with an eye to the sky. The sun moved slowly over the tiled roofs, casting broad shadows by mid-afternoon. Garments were spread on low hedgerows, over stone walls warmed by sun, or on long lines strung between orchard trees. Larger items, such as sheets and tablecloths, were doubled over and pinned at the ends to prevent sagging. Clothespins, carved from willow or olive wood, were stored in a small basket and inspected at the start of each season for cracks or mold. A broken pin was not discarded lightly. It might be trimmed down and used to repair another. In the evenings, the laundry was collected, carefully shaken, and carried indoors. Each item was refolded and stacked, often in the same order it was washed. Wrinkles were smoothed by hand or pressed with a glass bottle, warmed slightly by sun or water. Ironing, when done, was reserved for special occasions. A flat iron, filled with hot coals or heated on the stove, was used for collars, napkins, or festive garments. The scent of warm cloth, touched by coal and air, drifted quietly through the home. In more mountainous regions, such as the Pyrenees or the Alps, where drying space was limited and sun exposure inconsistent, Alternate methods developed. Families constructed wooden frames that could be folded and stored when not in use. These racks, set indoors by the hearth, held smaller items such as socks and underclothes. In summer, the same racks might be taken outdoors and positioned on balconies, porches, or ledges where the sun fell longest. Laundry in such climates required patience. A woolen shawl might take 2 full days to dry. A pair of stockings, turned inside out and back again, might require checking and repositioning half a dozen times. To hasten the process without causing damage, some households wrapped garments in dry linen and pressed them between boards weighted with stones. This absorbed moisture gradually and minimized the chance of mildew. In many homes, the folding and storage of clean laundry was a time for quiet. It was often done in the late afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the day's work neared its close. A woman might sit by the window, folding each piece with care, pausing to inspect hems and seams. A child might be nearby, mimicking the folding with small cloths, or simply watching. No special announcement was made, no instructions spoken aloud. The learning came through proximity. The final step in many households was the return of laundry to its designated place. In homes where space was shared between generations, this process followed a practiced pattern. Grandparents' linens were stored in one chest, parents in another, children's in baskets near the bed. Each person had a known number of items, so many shirts, so many underclothes, so many linens for their cot or corner. Disruption in this count prompted inquiry, not from suspicion, but from habit. A missing item meant it was still drying, or had been misplaced, or required mending. When a garment required repair, it was placed in a small basket, kept specifically for that purpose. This basket might reside near the hearth or in the still room, depending on the home's arrangement. Repairs were done with threads saved from older garments or with mismatched colors, the irregular stitching a quiet testimony to necessity. Patches were often cut from the same cloth when possible, but even when not, they were applied with care. A patch was not shameful, it was a sign of stewardship. In towns where washerwomen worked professionally, the end of a laundry cycle involved the return of items to clients. These laundresses, trusted, familiar figures, kept mental records of which item belonged where. They recognized garments by frayed edges, unique stitching, or initials inked into the hem. Their baskets were lined with clean cloth, and garments were folded with a uniform crease. Payment was given in coin or goods, a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a skein of yarn, and though their work was essential, it was often conducted in silence, their arrival and departure marked only by the creak of a cart or the lift of a latch. As with all rhythms of domestic life, laundry was sometimes interrupted by circumstance. A sudden illness might delay the weekly washing. A death in the household might require the laundering of black garments or the preparation of shrouds. A wedding or feast day might call for the pressing of fine linen stored for years. In each case, the task was resumed with quiet understanding, folded into the rest of life's events as naturally as breath. The soundscape of laundry was consistent across generations. The splash of water, the creak of the drying line, the soft slap of cloth on stone, the occasional call to a child, the low crackle of fire beneath the wash kettle. These sounds blended into the domestic background, never alarming, never rushed, always steady. And in the quiet that followed, after garments were stored, water poured away, and tools cleaned, there remained the subtle satisfaction of completion. Not celebration, but stillness. A well-ordered basket, a cleared line, a basin turned upside down to dry. The home rested, and with it so too did those who carried the weight of washing from stream to sun to drawer. Over time, the process of laundering became layered not only with routine, but with a gentle kind of memory. Each item carried its own history, and through years of washing, drying, folding, and mending, it took on a texture and form that reflected the life of the household itself. A work shirt, softened at the collar, bore the faint traces of countless summer days in the field. A tablecloth, its corners slightly uneven from years of stretching and pinning, held the imprint of shared meals, candle wax, and time. Clothing items were not easily replaced, and the value placed upon Their maintenance was reflected in the diligence of their care. When new garments were made or received, be it a homespun apron, a woolen winter cloak, or a baptismal gown sewn by hand, they entered into the household with quiet significance. These garments, especially the finer or more formal ones, were often washed only after their first season of use, unless visibly soiled. Washing too soon or too vigorously could prematurely wear the fibers, so they were worn, brushed, aired, and folded away again, with the promise that they would last. The tools used in laundering remained remarkably consistent in form and purpose. Wooden washboards, made from pine or beech, became smoother with time, and in some regions were oiled at season's end to preserve them through winter. Paddles, when they cracked or splintered, were repaired with strips of cloth, wound tightly, and secured with pins until the tool could be replaced or retired. In poorer households, implements were sometimes shared between neighbors or extended family. A single large basin, for instance, might serve several cottages, pass between homes according to a mutual, unwritten understanding. Water sources also bore a kind of social character, a well that never ran dry, a stream that flowed steadily even in late summer, or a stone basin built by a grandfather became not only part of the landscape but part of the family's rhythm. In larger communities, families developed quiet customs around shared water sources, designated days, spoken or unspoken cues, and a shared sense of responsibility for cleanliness and respect. A woman might arrive and wait, not with impatience, but with her hands already sorting or stitching, knowing that the work would be done in its time. Soap remained precious. Whether purchased from local makers or prepared at home, it was never used wastefully. Some families kept the smallest slivers of old soap and melted them down together, pouring the mixture into a small wooden mold to be reused. The scent, when present, was simple and familiar: bay, rosemary, or plain tallow. In homes where herbal gardens flourished, soap was sometimes rubbed with crushed mint or rubbed against lemon balm leaves before application, giving only the faintest impression of freshness. When soap was unavailable or impractical, other methods were employed. Clothes could be scrubbed with sand, pressed between wet reeds, or beaten repeatedly against flat stones in moving water. The goal was not sterilization, but freshness and comfort. Stains were not always removed. Instead, they were softened, faded, and made less noticeable. A garment bearing a faint shadow of soil or oil was not seen as unclean, but as lived in. Likewise, garments were judged less by brightness than by scent and texture. A shirt that smelled of sun and air, that felt smooth and even beneath the palm, was considered clean, even if it bore a patch or a faint mark. Standards of cleanliness were practical, and they emphasized maintenance over perfection. In many regions, traditions developed around laundering and key life events. It was customary, for instance, to prepare a trousseau, a collection of fine linens and garments, for a young woman before her marriage. These items, often sewn and embroidered over years, were stored carefully in chests lined with herbs and cloth. When finally washed for use, the laundering was done with particular care. The water was scented with herbs. The drying lines were wiped clean. The garments were turned and folded 3 times, then pressed beneath a smooth board, and left in the quietest corner of the home. At the end of life, too, laundry held its role. Burial shrouds were washed in silence, without soap, in water drawn before dawn. In some traditions, they were dried not in the open, but indoors, folded in darkness, and wrapped in linen until the time of need. There were homes in which these cloths were kept in the lowest drawer, or in a chest that no one opened without reason. They were not discussed, only remembered. Seasons passed, and so did garments. In spring, the heavier woolens were washed one last time, brushed carefully, folded tightly, and stored in sealed chests. In summer, lighter linens were washed more frequently, hung quickly in the sun, and shaken out before dusk. In autumn, as winds picked up and the harvest began, garments took on the smell of smoke, apples, and stored hay. They were washed more sparingly, but always aired and tended. In winter, laundering slowed, and the cloth hung near the fire retained the scent of wood smoke and stone. Through all these seasons the practice endured, the slow swirl of a cloth in a basin, the weight of water in the hands, the sound of a line tightening in the wind. These things did not change. They were inherited not as stories, but as gestures, folded into the daily life of the home. A daughter, watching her mother's hands move in rhythm, absorbed the motions without instruction. A son, sent to carry water, learned by the pull of the bucket and the distance to the stream. These were lessons written in repetition, not in words, and in time they passed forward again. In the quiet of evening, once the last garment had been returned to its drawer and the fire had settled into embers, the laundry basin might be turned on its side to dry. The paddle leaned against the wall. The soap wrapped and stored. The line emptied of its weight. And there, in the hush of the moment, with no ceremony, no song, and no written record, the household stood at rest, made clean again by steady hands, by patience, and by the oldest rhythm of all. In the final view of this long, quiet tradition, laundry, performed for centuries without soap as we know it, without mechanical agitation, without timers or thermostats, emerges not as a chore, but as a sustained attentive art. Its tools were few, its pace was slow, its voice was near silent, and yet it carried the very heart of daily life in every fold and fiber it touched. The act itself required little change over time, because the materials remained familiar, and the principles simple. Water, warmed by fire. Ashes, sifted by hand. Cloth, shaped by wear and need. A tub carved or bound from wood. A paddle smoothed by use. A line tied between trees, fence posts, or beams. These were not innovations. They were extensions of the hand, the body, the seasons. The spaces in which laundry occurred were just as modest. A low-roofed outbuilding with walls of stone, or wattle and daub. A riverbank where the light fell gently on the surface of the water. A warm corner near the hearth, where garments hung from rafters, steaming slightly in winter air. There was no need for walls of polished tile or mechanical noise. There was only steam and air and the soft weight of wet cloth in the arms. In this quiet work, no two households followed exactly the same method, yet nearly all shared its central elements. Whether in a mountainside village, a coastal hamlet, a town deep in a valley, or a farmstead surrounded by fields, laundering remained linked to the environment, to resourcefulness, and to time. It was deeply local, yet universally understood. Its language was gesture, a touch to feel the dampness of a hem, a glance at the sky before stringing the line, the practiced twist of fabric to draw out the last of the water. These were not things written down. They were shown, mimicked, passed on with neither praise nor question. And the result, fresh linen folded neatly, garments brushed and laid out, bedding sweetened by air and sun, was not only comfort, but assurance. That the house was tended, that care had been taken, that what was soiled could be made clean again, in a manner known and trusted. In the quiet lives of countless people, laundry created pause. It demanded presence. It resisted haste, and by its very nature it was always returning. Garments were never washed once, or perfectly. They were cleaned, used, cleaned again, each cycle gently wearing in the fabric, each repetition reinforcing not just the cloth, but the memory of use. Even as the world changed, spinning faster with the rise of factories, of plumbed water, of packaged soap and electric heat, the echoes of that older rhythm remained. A basin kept under the sink, a line strung in the backyard, the scent of clean sheets, sun-dried, the memory of a mother's hands folding shirts, a grandmother's basket, a child's first attempt to carry a bundle of towels. These things endure. And now, as the machines hum quietly in the background of modern life, and synthetic perfumes drift from rows of detergent bottles, the stillness of that older world feels distant, but not forgotten. It lives in the steady hands that still fold with care, in the instinct to brush off lint before hanging a garment, in the comfort of a familiar cotton shirt, softened by years of wear and washing, It lives, too, in the calm we find in repetition, in the cycles that ask nothing more than attention, patience, and presence. It reminds us that there is dignity in care, in maintaining, in returning something to order. And so ends the long, slow telling of how laundry was once done, before soap, before machines, before haste. A history not of invention, but of continuation, not of progress, but of persistence, not loud, but lasting. A washboard leaning quietly against the wall, a folded towel placed neatly in its place, a line gently swaying in the wind, and the home once more at rest.